MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby. Hey guys, thanks for joining us for another episode of the MessianTics podcast. We are going to dive into a conversation that in some ways and others we've kind of touched on over the last 2.5 seasons of this show in different ways, but it's a little more pertinent today, particularly because there's been conversation on social media that addresses this and brings about some different opinions and attitudes and such. And so we want to dive into a conversation on the discussion of what are often called the distinctions between Jew and Gentile, especially as regards Messianic Judaism, and how that relates to our local congregations, how it relates organizationally, how it relates to individuals, Jewish and non-Jewish, in our communities, what it may say to the greater Jewish community, the greater believing community, and so on and so forth. But we want to just dive into this conversation. There can sometimes be some condescension in the way that people talk about stuff. There's definitely some barriers that are put up by certain individuals within the Messianic Jewish movement that prohibit involvement in certain areas or different avenues for Gentiles in the movement and so on. And generally speaking, I can speak for both of our congregations, Congregation Mayim Chaim in Daphne, Alabama, where Rabbi Toby and myself serve, and Bridon Messianic Synagogue in Pensacola, Florida, where Rabbi Eric and Rabbi Jonathan both serve, is our congregations are very open and inclusive for Gentiles in our community, and we are very intentional about being Messianic Jewish synagogues that are home for Jews and Gentiles alike, who have a calling, a yearning, a desire to further understand the Jewishness of the good news, the Jewishness of the scriptures, the Jewishness of the promised Jewish Messiah, and how that relates. And so on. And so we're going to dive into this conversation, and I'll be upfront and honest, we're having this conversation from our perspectives, and our perspective is not always the broad brush perspective of the movement as a whole, but we want to talk from our perspective and maybe give a different angle than potentially some in the movement have presented over the years. So with that said, I'm going to throw that out there and let the conversation kind of take on a life of its own from here.
Okay, this is Rabbi Eric, and I want to start out by setting a couple of parameters for the discussion, if we can at least. And so our discussion today is not, do Gentiles have to keep Torah? Do Jews have to keep Torah? What is that whole discussion? That's not really what we're talking about today. I want to establish right off that when we're talking about the things we're talking about, I want everybody to understand not one of the four of us sitting at this table believe that anybody keeps the whole Torah. Not even Yeshua kept every commandment in the Torah. He wasn't a woman. He couldn't keep any commandments to women. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a farmer. There's lots of commandments, right, that are related to roles and responsibility to that role. What we're really talking about today is, or wanting to talk about today, is the inclusion of non-Jewish people within our community as co-laborers and an equal part of our community to the point that they desire to be. And so this result comes from this idea of protecting Jewish identifiers within congregational life. And this need in some people's minds to limit involvement in non-Jewish people in our congregations to certain aspects, but allowing the Jewish members to have full reign and participation in everything. And I'm talking about this from a position of a Messianic rabbi, but through the eyes of a shepherd in that direction, because my concern isn't just the right and wrong of it, but it goes beyond that to how do those from the non-Jewish community that become part of us feel, and how are they treated within our community in these ways. And I think, when I first came to faith in Yeshua, I came to faith in a church where my wife had attended, I was raised in Judaism, and then when I came to faith in a church, and that church outlawed television. Television was evil. You can't own a television. You can't. And my thought to it was, well, I guess they think it's easier to outlaw it than it is to actually teach people to have self-control, to govern their actions, to make decisions for themselves, to do things. And I think that to a large extent, this discussion comes from, it's easier just to put a dividing line in the ground than to actually deal with teaching how somebody can be part of something without becoming that. In other words, if, and I've made this statement recently, if a non-Jewish person eats matzo ball soup, no Jewish person looks at them and says, you can't eat that because that's a Jewish identifier and it'll blur the lines and confuse people. If a non-Jewish person eats a bagel with lox and cream cheese on it, Jewish people don't look at it and say that's a blurring of identifiers and we need to not do that. You can't eat that bagel. Now, Jewish people can have the bagel with lox and cream cheese here, but you're going to have something else because someone might see you eating that and assume that you think you're Jewish now because you're eating that.
Yeah, you got to have cinnamon raisin with butter.
Right. So it's the same way with the things that people are talking about in this discussion, that a non-Jewish person can come to our synagogue and wear a talit, for instance, or a kippah, without them thinking that by putting those clothes on, those garments on, that their genetics change and now they're Jewish, and living in that way that confuses the roles and responsibilities within the community, because there are roles and responsibilities that the Gentiles have or non-Jews have that aren't given to Jews, and likewise the other way around. So when we look at this stuff, for instance, people get all up in arms about Gentiles wearing talit, but they don't have any problem with Gentiles wearing kippot. Well, I know that talits are commanded and kippots are kind of inferred in the scripture, so I understand that. But the reality is, if you go around the world today and a person wears a kippah, everybody looks at him and goes, that's a Jew. But if somebody just wears fringes on their garments, the vast majority of people have no idea what tzitziot are and what they are. And they don't look at them and say, oh, that person's a Jew. They go, what are those fringes about?
And the truth of the matter to that effect is that the talit gadol, the ceremonial talit that we wear in services and prayer and so on, the talit gadol is viewed by most as honoring the mitzvah of wearing tzitziot. And so there are those that wear talit katan and so on, but it's viewed in most of Judaism as fulfilling that commandment by putting on a talit gadol for prayers and so on. And so it is more common to see somebody wearing a kippah and no tzitzit, or at least no tzitzit visible, than it is to see somebody wearing tzitzit. And so not only is the kippah one of the most recognizable Jewish identifiers, but a kippah is something that is more common to see than tzitziot.
Right, and so we're dealing with this from this perspective, and the understanding is, or the debate on this comes from verses in Numbers 15, where it talks about Bnei Israel wearing the fringes on their garments. Now, the debate comes from the understanding that there are, in Numbers 15, there are verses that talk about the native born, and there are those that talk about the outsider, or those from generations that come to you. And so their debate says, when it talks about Bnei Israel, it's talking about the Jewish people. And when it talks about these outsiders, it's talking about the non-Jewish people. And that in this particular commandment that deals with the fringes, it just says Bnei Israel. I want to contend that when it says Bnei Israel there, it's talking to the people that have now 2 years out of Egypt. You know, the book of Numbers begins 2 years after they leave Egypt. And so there is the Jews and the mixed multitude that are there, that are all considered B'nai Israel, and this command is given to B'nai Israel, which includes both the Jewish-born or the natural descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this mixed multitude who all stood at the mountain and said all that you said we would do. But then when it talks about whenever the outsider resides with you or whoever among your generations to come, then it's talking about those additional people from outside, the strangers that would join themselves to Israel in addition to those who are already present. In other words, this commandment is given to those who are here right now, but there are going to be other people that come in, and you're to treat those outsiders in this same way. You're to welcome them in to do these things. And so it's not saying we're talking to Jews and we're not talking to non-Jews, but we're talking to everybody here today, B'nai Israel, which is covered again when Paul speaks and he talks about the Gentiles who were once far off, but now have drawn near and became part of the commonwealth of Israel. Now, that doesn't make Gentiles Jews, but it does put them under the governance of those laws that were given to all Israel, not the individual rules, for instance, for Kohanim or kings or different segment groups within Israel, but the commandments that were given to all Israel are universal to all people, regardless of whether they're Jewish by genetics or they're non-Jewish and have become grafted into that olive tree. So when we see it talking about B'nai Israel in this verse, it's talking about the Tzitziot in Numbers 15, beginning at verse 37. I believe it's talking to both the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people who were part of that mixed multitude that came out of Egypt, that are now all part of Israel, with differences between being Jewish by birth or genetics and non-Jewish, but governed by the same country, or I'm trying to think of the word, what would it be? Not, we're all Americans, or we're all English, or we're all Hungarian, or we're all Israeli by nationality, but not necessarily by genetics or genealogy. And so he's talking to this group of people known as B'nai Israel, who are a nationality. They have become a nation now made up of both Jews and non-Jews. And we see this as, for instance, we see the judges become leaders within Israel, and the very first judge, I believe the very first judge, was a Gentile.
Yeah, Othniel, the brother of Caleb.
Right, the brother of Caleb. So we see this inclusion.
Yeah, it specifically says Othniel the Kenizzite, not Othniel the Israelite.
Right, and this inclusion of non-Jewish people. Now, again, I think that there should be distinctions between Jewish and non-Jewish people within our community based upon their genealogy, but I don't think that the things that were given, for instance, that Tzitziot were given to B'nai Israel so that when they looked upon it, they wouldn't sin against God. I don't think that God looked at the Jewish people and said, I want to give you something that will remind you not to sin, but you Gentile people among us, I don't really care if you sin, so you don't get this reminder.
Or you just have to figure it out.
You guys just, don't worry about it, or I don't think that's what we're dealing with here, but that's kind of what the modern understanding of those who believe that Gentiles shouldn't wear tzitziot, or they shouldn't, in the case of this discussion that I saw online, they shouldn't lead liturgy. You're okay to participate in liturgy, but you can't lead liturgy in the synagogue. I don't see that. I think, again, Othniel, the judge of Israel, was a Gentile. I think that if there was a job, if we were looking at hierarchy of value of jobs, or I think that a judge of all Israel would come higher than somebody leading liturgy in the limitations. If God was going to limit the involvement of Gentiles in things, I think it would be being a judge of Israel much more than somebody leading people in praise and worship, which liturgy is part of praise and worship in our synagogue. So I see this more personally as more of a dividing and a cause of unnecessary division, where simply teaching people, like at our congregation, at your congregation, CMC, as far as I know, not one of the non-Jewish people that attend your synagogue, not one of the non-Jewish people who attend our synagogue is confused about their genealogy, because we share openly that we are a unity made up of diverse people from different backgrounds, and that you don't have to give up your personal culture to become part of what we are as a community. So we have people from other nations, and when I talk about other nations, I'm talking about like Africa and Europe and others that are part of our congregation, that they may speak another language, they may cook other types of food, they may do those kind of things, but when they're unified together, we become one in worshiping God. And our German congregants don't believe they change their genealogy when they become part of our congregation. And so it really becomes something that's a hurtful thing to non-Jewish people that makes them feel, whether intentional or unintentional, less than. And I don't think it's God's intention for anybody to be less than. Matter of fact, I believe I read in the Bible where God is not a respecter of persons, where he doesn't look at one person higher than another.
Yeah, I was going to say that the people that may be confused when they do come to our congregations, they usually are confused about a great many things, and we ask them to leave anyway. Because it's
obvious they're not teachable.
Yeah. It's normally not the I may be Jewish thing that gets people kicked out. It's the other stuff that they bring with that extension of confusion. So,
do you think the Cherokee Indians are really Jewish? Because I read it somewhere once.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
I don't know. But it's almost as if there's this battle that because there is this kind of this fight that exists between the Messianic Jewish world and to the greater extent what we would call the Hebrew roots world, which is much of it exists with this paradigm of like, we have to go and evangelize every one of the nations and teach them, that you have to today start keeping Torah and wearing tzitzit and eating kosher and doing this. Whereas Messianic Judaism really didn't start that way. It really was a place where Jews could continue to be Jewish and worship the Messiah of Israel. And so, this, and again, I'm speaking to this particular fight that's within the synagogues. I'm not speaking to the going out into the nations thing. That's a topic for another day. But when it comes to within the congregational model and fold, if you have people who are coming in who desire to be a part of what you're doing, who have experienced and are acting upon this call that God, this place that God has brought them to, where they are in a Messianic community, under Messianic teaching, living a Messianic lifestyle on a Messianic, a Jewish calendar, celebrating Jewish holidays and feasts, it makes no sense to tell them, well, even though you're here participating, there's a clear calling for you to be here, and you're doing this, and there's clearly no spiritual obstacle to you being here, compared to wherever you were before. There's no reason to bar them from participating in the congregation. Why wouldn't you have them come up and read? Why wouldn't you have them come and wear a talit with tzitzit and a kippah? And again, if you're a congregation where you don't encourage people to wear talits or kippah, that's your prerogative, that's your congregation. But if you're a Messianic Jewish congregation where your part of your outward identification as Jewish worshipers is the wearing of tzitzit, at least on Shabbat, with a talit gadol or even just a talit katan. I've seen people do that. And reading from the Torah scroll, reading from the Tanakh, saying the blessings, the opening and closing blessings associated with that, saying the liturgy that's associated with the typical Sabbath prayers. If you have someone there and they're non-Jewish, why would they not also participate in that. Because it's not like you're bringing in a Southern Baptist who then is going to go try on Sunday to go and force the Southern Baptist Church to also say the same liturgy you said on Shabbat and read from the same readings you read on Shabbat, or tell everybody you all need to be wearing tallits and stuff. It's like that's not his or her place, and that's often not what they're trying to do. They're trying to be a part of the community in which they find themselves. For whatever reason, God's brought them to your door. It would be like bringing in any guest, to your household, and you're, I don't know, doing a paint and sip, and part of doing the paint and sip is to wear a frock so you don't get paint on your clothes, and then denying them, be like, well, you're not really a part of what we're doing here, you're not really here to drink of the same wine and paint the same paint, so like you can't wear a frock like the rest of us. It's a part of how the community worships. It's a part of the expression. And so when you deny the people there to the ability to be a part of the expression, then it becomes, you create issues that shouldn't exist. You create challenges that don't need to be there. So then it becomes, okay, the focus is no longer on just worshiping God. It's on maintaining control over who's wearing what, over who's doing what, and there already has to be a modicum of control just to make sure that everything stays in order. And if these are people who are acting within order, behaving in order, submitting to themselves to the teaching authority of the leadership of this congregation, it makes no sense to say no, even though you were here singing the same songs, the same words, worshiping in the same way, living the same way with us inside and out of the walls of this congregation. No, this one day a week you cannot wear a tallit, you cannot wear a kippah, you can't read from the Bible up front, you can't lead, and it just completely...
Right. And I've seen places where, and heard of places where if you're going to read from the Torah, now I'm not even talking about rolling the scroll and reading, but if you're going to read scriptures from the Torah part of the Bible, you have to be Jewish.
Right.
But if you're non-Jewish, you can read from the Brit Chadashah,
right?
Which somehow is like, okay, this is the Gentile part of the Bible.
Right.
When the reality is the entire Bible deals with Jew and non-Jew throughout the whole thing. And one of the things that we try to do at our congregation is differentiate between terms we use. So people are Jewish, but our faith is Judaism, and you can follow Judaism without being Jewish. So you're a non-Jewish person can practice Judaism without being Jewish, and that these actions are not like Jewish identifiers, but identifiers of Judaism, or even more precise, biblical identifiers. These are ways you identify as the people of God, regardless of your genetics.
Right. And again, we're not trying to force everyone to do everything the Torah says. If anything, we're supposed to help those who come desiring to worship God with as much as they are able to give. One of my favorite stories in the Tanakh is when Naaman comes for healing, comes seeking Elisha for healing. And when he's done, he asks Elisha that he would be able to have some dirt. That's all he wants. He's like, I need to have some dirt so that I can worship on like the ground that God has promised to his people, the ground of God. And Elisha says yes. And then with that, he's like, go and be blessed. Like that's what you asked for. That's what you came. You have no desire to sit in my house. You're not desiring to sojourn with the people of Israel. But the Torah again and again and again says, if you have those among you who sojourn among you, if you have those who come to live among you, they're here to walk with you, to travel with you, to live with you, to eat with you, to sleep with you, to die with you. Then they're told this is for them too. when it comes to Passover, they have to be circumcised, but yeah, they can do that. If they get circumcised, they can participate in Passover, but otherwise, that would be one of the few restrictions to any sort of observance of many of the things within the Torah, and going up to the Temple Mount. But everything else, they are invited. They're asked to, if you desire to sojourn with God and the people of God, you can do this. You can be a part. Again, it's not about making everyone do all of this, opposed to what they're able to perceive and do at the time. Again, Naaman's a perfect example. He asked for dirt simply to be able to go and make offerings on, to pray on, and Elisha bids him go in peace and to do with the dirt and to do as he asks. Later early Messianic writings, such as the Didache, encourages people to bear what you can. It doesn't. So you're not going to become. You're not going to look Jewish in your worship immediately. It may take you decades, to even be confused as being Jewish in your worship and in your expression, because no one can take everything all at once and change overnight and remain that way, remain sane. And that's where, elements like the Hebrew roots world goes wrong, is you have a lot of people who end up trying to change everything all at once, driving away their family members, driving away their congregations, and then they end up not even being believers at all in 3, 5, 6, 10 years' time, because they've, dismantled everything and nothing good has come to replace it. So there has to be, within the Messianic community, it's about giving people what they come for, and people come for piety. The biggest, and this will be a book project that I'm going to write on one day, is the biggest reason non-Jews come to the Messianic Jewish movement is because they come looking for piety. Often they come from the non-denominational world, Protestant evangelical world, where not a lot of piety is offered. There's not a lot of behaviors and activities that encourage acts of piety. And they're looking for something more. They're looking for something where the faith is entrenched and grounded and rooted. And so they find Messianic Judaism. And how shameful it would be for someone who comes desiring God and to live a more pious life, for us to then tell them, no, you can't. It's inconceivable to me. Because especially in the world as it exists today, you would think we would latch on to every possible opportunity to teach people more about God and to actually embrace the calling of Israel, which is exactly that.
This is Rabbi Toby. Just in the off chance, I guess somebody wants to address something I say, you know where to find us.
Timestamp.
So the problem is. I can begin with just my life in the movement. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but so the first thing is that David Stern, in his New Testament commentary, Jewish New Testament commentary, David Stern says that there are distinctions between Jews and Gentiles or non-Jews, but those should never be grounds for discrimination. So when somebody makes the argument that a Gentile shouldn't wear talits or do liturgy, so you're discriminating. Now, they wouldn't see it that way, because some people really are dedicated to being right in their own eyes. So they're going to find a reason to say, but you are discriminating. Here's my story. So 20 years ago, called into the movement, and it doesn't have to matter to whoever hears it, but it matters to me. So 20 years ago, I was called into the movement. When I walked into a Messianic synagogue for the first time, something came over me. I did everything I could to keep from crying through the whole service. Hearing the Hebrew language was making me cry. I couldn't understand why. I didn't understand what I was seeing or what I was hearing, but I knew that something was happening to me internally. And it was the Lord. I prayed for a year before I got my first talit. I have a whole slew of them at home now. Over the years, I've gifted talits to Jews and non-Jews. And I still own many, and I wear them every Shabbat. I'm not trying to sound. I prayed for a year before that. It was very important to me that I understood it, and that it was something that really meant something to me. I have been a cantor in Messianic synagogues since 2010. How did that happen? I was on the worship team. Our cantor left, and I was asked to be the cantor. Now, I could have said, wait a minute, is there a Jewish guy here who's a cantor? No, the Jewish rabbi at the synagogue said, I would like for you to be the cantor. And that started it in 2010. I'm still a cantor. I've been a worship leader and a youth leader. I'm currently an assistant rabbi. I can read and write Hebrew. I lead the Torah service. I can read from the Torah scroll. I can lean the Torah. I lead the bar mitzvah program, help lead the bar mitzvah program at our congregation. My son is in a shrenu, learning Hebrew. My wife and I prayed and felt led to circumcise our son on the 8th day. Now, I've said quite a bit of things, but someone can answer this 3 ways. You can say, every single thing that I've done for the past 20 years has been wrong and not led by the Holy Spirit. Now, if you say that, you have a problem because you're passing judgment on what you think God is doing in my life. Okay, well, have fun with that if you'd like to do that. The second thing is if you say, no, it's not a problem, then it destroys some of the arguments that some of these people make. My brothers in the faith and sisters in the faith that make these arguments. If you say, you know what, I don't have a right to judge, well, then that also destroys your argument, because if you don't have a right to judge, then you shouldn't be you shouldn't be platforming arguments such as, Gentiles shouldn't do this. If you think one person possibly could do it. See, it used to be, I could say, to explain Ruth. The problem is I've heard a rabbi say, well, Ruth is one person. So apparently God has to do something a lot of times for it to be accepted as truth. Yeshua said certain things once. Well, he didn't say it. He only said that one time, so we don't have to worry about it. So Ruth was one person. She wasn't, but she was an example that they really highlighted. The mixed multitude I've heard as a great example of how God included Gentiles, but I've also heard the argument that, well, that's one thing. That was one time. So how many times does God have to do it? So the problem is that what I see people doing is they take the Word of God and they add their own weights and measures to it. How they measure what God says as much as they want to measure it. And they put as much weight as they want to put on something God says and put more weight on something else. And that is really slippery. Here's some other problems that I have with this. Jewish people, of course, are, and I'm talking about from the perspective of people who make this argument that Gentiles shouldn't be included completely. Intermarried is an issue for me. Why? Well, obviously a Jewish couple's fine. But what's interesting is what some people don't see, how insidiously superior this argument, an argument of superiority is. Oh, I see. So my Gentile self and my Gentile wife, we need to be excluded, but your Gentile wife or husband is lucky because they got picked by a Jewish person, so they get to do this stuff. So that's a problem. And if someone's partially Jewish, someone's 25%, whatever the fraction is. How do you measure how much they do? So if someone's 25% Jewish, can they wear a talit for 15 minutes of the service? Can they bar mitzvah one of their kids if they have 4? Okay. Do you have... I see that some people who make this argument fail to address a bigger issue. Most Jewish believers still go to church. Are they just as wrong as me? Should they be excluded from church life? How many Jewish pastors have we talked about on this podcast? How many Jewish pastors do you know that are pastors? Are they wrong for being a pastor and not a rabbi? No, we don't hear about that. The problem is these Gentiles coming in. It's not that most Jewish believers go to church. Nobody wants to know why that is. So I say, Jewish believers have more options. If they want to go to church, they can do that and do anything they want. They can also do anything they want in a Messianic synagogue. It's Gentiles that need to know their place. That's a problem. The other problem is that these people who make this argument say that when someone asks them, well, what should Gentiles do? Well, attend the service seems to be like enough for them. Like, well, they should attend the service. Isn't that great? Okay. They can volunteer. Okay. It used to be that you could say things like Isaiah 56, where God says to the foreigners who hold fast my Shabbats and hold fast to my covenant. Okay. I don't know what that... Tell me what that means.
You can fill the tzedakah box, too.
I've heard people who make this argument say, I hope that these Gentiles who are coming into Messianic synagogues are there to serve the Jewish people. Well, I hope so too. How about this? Jewish people are supposed to serve the nations. I don't know. I mean, it's supposed to be cyclical. To say nothing of the fact that there are problems too, like this. my wife and I, who are 100% Gentiles, have been accused of being Jewish because we've excelled in areas of ministry in the Messianic synagogue. And so it's clear that some people want to die on this hill, and they probably will. Like, they're going to die on that hill. And my thing is that you have the right to believe anything you want. I mean, I can believe that the Jedi religion is real in Star Wars. I'm going to reap the fruits thereof. You're going to reap the fruits of having this kind of theology. You're going to reap the fruits of that. But I tell you this much, you know what I've noticed? It's not stopping what God's doing with Israel and the nations coming together. Now, you can be that voice that says, The problem is that if you think you're so right, you can't see the issues with your argument, like, well, wait a minute. So it's okay if you're intermarried. So it's okay if you choose. So I'm Jewish. If I'm a Jewish guy, well, I don't want this Gentile couple, but I've chosen a Gentile. I'm allowed to choose a Gentile wife, and she gets to do this Jewish stuff. Or the people who are partially Jewish. There's no ironclad proof that, give me some statistics that it's harmful. What does your research say about the harm this is doing?
Yeah, well, and it doesn't last. I know there was recently, I like to follow like archaeological digs in Israel. There was a synagogue that they had dug up that was, they had identified as a Messianic synagogue. Like, this was clearly a Messianic place of worship. Given the art and everything found within, the iconography found within. And, it was like, yeah, they've been able to trace this to one of the Messianic communities that existed and died out within Judea, largely because it did not follow the call to incorporate the nations. And that's the thing. You see, the other communities within the Yeshua movement who embrace the Gentiles coming in, they grow and expand and are here. Have lasted 2,000 years. Those other communities die out, and again, it's not because they didn't bear truth. They bore the truth of the gospel. They bore the truth of the Tanakh, the Torah. But, they said, no, we're Jewish only, so our children can only marry Jews. We'll only associate with Jews. And the rest of the Jewish world was busy trying to figure out how to leave the Messianics in the dust and formatting their own religious understanding without Messiah, their own religious understanding without the temple, and going on to be themselves. And so these third groupings of Messianics who only wanted to be Jewish and didn't embrace that call, they died out. And this Messianic movement, we kind of find ourselves looking at this precipice. Those Messianic groups and organizations and congregations today who embrace the call to the nations, inviting the nations in to teach them what it means to be a worshiper of God, they will last. They will grow. But if we embrace and fall into this trap of being Jewish only, it won't last. It can't. It was never designed to be that way. God didn't create it to be that way.
One of my...
No, I'm just saying, and I think just the biggest issue, just going back to what I said, I think the biggest issue, I think that upsets me more than anything, is when you use ironclad biblical examples like the mixed multitude or Ruth, and the response that I've heard two different parties say is, that happened one time. I would just like to remind everyone that Yeshua died on the cross one time.
He resurrected.
One time.
Yeah. So my favorite verse, and I know you want to jump in, but let me jump in real quick on... my favorite verse in discussing this comes from 2 Kings 17. In 2 Kings 17, Judah and Israel have backslidden. They've fallen away from God. They're following the ways of Israel in idolatry and all of that. And so God banishes them from the land. And the Assyrians bring in people from other nations to Israel. So all the Jews are gone. There's just Gentiles there. And the scripture says that God sent lions among these Gentiles because they didn't know the requirements of the God of the land. So the king of Assyria sends for one priest. So they bring one Jew into the land to teach the Gentiles the requirements of the God of the land, so that these Gentiles would live their lives according to God's commandments and mitzvot.
I can just imagine,
again, this is one Cohen, one priest who comes in among a whole nation of Gentiles that were living in Israel, And God sent this priest there so that he would teach the Gentiles how to live Judaic lives in the land of Israel because lions were killing them. Yeah. And we look at this and say, well, we can't have Gentiles doing Jewish stuff because God wouldn't have that. It appears from this verse that God will have Gentiles do Jewish stuff, quotation marks, Judaic stuff, and that there were repercussions on these Gentiles for being in a Jewish space and not doing Jewish stuff. It blows my mind that you can look at verses like this and then say...
That only happened one time, though.
And then say, this is a Jewish space, and therefore Gentiles don't need to participate in any of the Jewish stuff. Because here's a Jewish space that had no Jews in it, but God required the Gentiles to learn Jewish stuff in order to exist without dying in a Jewish space.
I can just see, his parents are being taken off to, captivity, but his mom's just like, that's my boy going back to the land to teach him to do what they need to do. There he goes. So proud of him.
So I want to hit on a couple of things real quick. First and foremost is, as Rabbi Toby mentioned, Isaiah says several times that Israel is to be a light to the nations. That's the distinct role of Israel, and I like to make things as simple as I possibly can in my understanding of things, and so I believe wholeheartedly that Israel's responsibility, Israel's divine calling, is to be a light to the nations, to carry the God of Israel to the nations, His word to the nations, and likewise, I believe Romans makes it clear that the nations are brought into the body of Messiah to drive the Jew to jealousy for their God, or another way I like to word it is to be a light to the Jewish people, and so I believe it's a cyclical reality. We work together to see that goal come about. As a Jewish believer, just because I believe in Yeshua doesn't mean that my divine calling as a Jewish person has changed. I'm still to be a light to the nations, and vice versa with the nations in a Messianic Jewish congregation, or the nations of the body of Messiah as a whole. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Likewise, I want to touch on, Rabbi Toby also mentioned Isaiah 56, and verse 6 says, which is what he was referencing, says, also the foreigners who join themselves to Adonai to minister to him, to love the name of Adonai, and to be his servants, all who keep from profaning Shabbat and hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, let them rejoice in my house of prayer. The burnt offerings and their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. Well, if they're participating in burnt offerings and sacrifices, they're participating in, for lack of a better way of wording it, quote-unquote Jewish identifying factors at the temple. But aside from that, he goes on to say in verse 7, the latter half of it, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. And that's an important thing to focus on, because when Yeshua goes into the temple and flips the money changers' tables, that's exactly what he says. And there's a reason he says it when he does that, and that's because where the money changers were operating was the court of the Gentiles. So what they were doing was they were prohibiting Gentiles from coming into worship in what limited capacity they were allowed to at the time. Right. They were prohibiting that by taking up their space to do something that was unholy, ungodly in the temple. And Yeshua quotes this verse, and I don't think he's just quoting it to make a point that the Gentiles should be in the courts of the Gentiles. I think he's quoting it to remind Israel of exactly who the nations that come to him are. And then with that, I want to also bring, and this kind of loops back to, I've got a couple of things I want to hit on. This also loops back to what I was talking about Israel being, or the Jewish people being a light to the nations being a light to the Jewish people, especially in the context of our faith in Messiah. And I want to bring up, there's a particular family in our congregation, I'm not going to mention their names, but there's a particular family in our congregation who have been in CMC for, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. They've been there for a while. Very, very faithful, very dedicated, involved in the ministry of the congregation, involved in service. They are not Jewish. The husband is one of our chazanim. The wife is on our worship team. They are not Jewish, but they are very faithful to Messianic Jewish life and practice. They don't pretend that they're Jewish. They're not putting on a show. They're not trying to do. But what has happened is God has used their faithfulness and their Messianic Jewish life and practice, even though they're not Jewish, God forbid, even though they're not Jewish, God has used their faithfulness and their Messianic Jewish life and practice to impact a Jewish family family in their neighborhood. That the husband in our congregation is a bus driver for the school system. He does that as like a part-time gig for kicks and giggles and for good insurance, because the school board has great insurance. And he wakes up stupid hour in the morning to go drive kids back and forth to school. Same thing in the afternoons. But where this relationship started was that one of the Jewish family in their neighborhood, their kids were on his bus and would drive back and forth, and they noticed he wasn't there one day, and they talked to him, hey, what? And he was like, oh, well, I forget if it was Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or whatever, but he mentioned that he was at synagogue. They're like, wait, are you Jewish? He goes, no. And they said, well, why are you at synagogue? And so it started this whole conversation. Then he developed a relationship with the parents, and so now their families celebrate they do Passover Seders together. They'll celebrate Erev Shabbat together. They'll do these kinds of things. And what's happening is they're having opportunity to share Messiah with this non-believing Jewish family who could give a crap less about whether they're Jewish or not, doing these Jewish identifying things, but they're being drawn to Messiah because they're witnessing Messiah in the life of this non-Jewish family, living faithfully in Messianic Jewish life and practice in their midst. And it's opened up a relationship, and this is the very literal sense. They're not going around and flouting and taunting and putting on a big show that they do Jewish stuff to quote-unquote drive Jews to jealousy. But that's exactly what's happening, is God is using their faithfulness as Gentiles who are being faithful in their Messianic Jewish call and their life and practice. And in the fact that they're fully included in our congregation, God's using that to be a light to the nations, and I mean to the Jewish people, to drive the Jewish family to jealousy for God in a very literal sense. And I'll be honest, Rabbi Toby and Rabbi Jonathan both mentioned that most Jewish believers aren't in Messianic synagogues. They're in the church. Why? Because the church is very good at being a light to the Jewish people, at driving the Jews to jealousy for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we're not. And part of the reason that Messianic Judaism is not as good at it is because we spend all of our time fighting over stupid crap like this, instead of actually doing what God has called us to do. But the last thing I want to bring up at the moment is the Gibeonites. You talked about Othniel, but the Gibeonites is another narrative in the early parts of the Tanakh post-Torah. And what we see particularly is in Joshua. The Gibeonites are the ones that come to Joshua and trick Joshua. Oh, we're from a long way away. Look at our wine bags. Look at this. Look at that. Our bread is stale, yada, yada. Joshua just takes them at face value, doesn't pray about it, doesn't seek God, makes a treaty with them, even though God says don't make a treaty with anybody. And then it blows up in his face. Well, the Gibeonites become the water carriers and so on and so forth for Israel. Basically, they become enslaved. For lack of a better way of wording, they become enslaved by Israel. And then we go to Ezra and Nehemiah, and we see the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple. And what's really interesting is when we look at that section of time in the Bible, they are very particular about saying only people that were verifiably Jewish were able to participate in rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple. The Gentiles that lived around the area that were upset that we were rebuilding came in, well, we want to help. We want to be a part of it. No, you can't do this. This is our thing. God put it on our backs to do this. You can't. But lo and behold, Ezra and Nehemiah mention that the Gibeonites were involved. It doesn't mention that the Gibeonites became converts and but it mentions the Gibeonites were involved in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And it doesn't mention them as converts. It doesn't mention them as being but specifically still calling them the Gibeonites. And that they were able, so at some point, they fully enveloped into Israel in one way or another, to a degree that coming back from Babylonian captivity, they were allowed to participate in the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the temple, while all of the pagan Gentiles around them weren't allowed to participate. And I think that's a loud statement. So Rabbi Toby says, was talking about how people will talk about Ruth and other, well, it's only one time. It's not only one time.
Right.
These things happen over and over and over again in the scriptures.
And I just want to say, I want to clarify, you can timestamp it, 48 minutes. I mentioned earlier that I've been accused of being Jewish by people in the movement, by Jewish people in the movement, because I've excelled, and my wife and I both have been accused of being Jewish by other Messianic Jews in the movement because we've excelled in things like worship, liturgy, and things like that. I stopped there, and I just want to clarify. I appreciate what they're saying, but the problem isn't being said, oh, you must be Jewish. That's not the issue. The issue I honestly have is when I say, no, I'm not, and then their response is, no. It's somewhere back there.
Somewhere in
It's got to be because you're too good at this. Now, But people who address the Gentile against Gentile inclusion, well, they don't address stuff like that.
Right.
Well, we can't talk about that. We can't talk about, I guess, Gentiles being good at this stuff, or those people can't talk about Gentiles being good at that stuff. The problem is that I have told, in fact, it was a rabbi, and my wife told, it's happened to me and my wife, where I said, no, I'm Gentile. No. It's back there somewhere. I'm telling you, you're too good at this. And I'm not saying that to my own horn. I'm saying that to say the problem is that if a Gentile's good at it, some Jewish people will say, oh, they must be Jewish. It's like, because it's as if
only Jews are good at things.
Only Jews have a predilection to this.
Yeah, Rabbi David was reading from Isaiah 56. I want to go a couple of verses before the verse that he read, because this verse is so significant to this conversation. In verse 2, it says, "Blessed is the one who does this, the Son of Man who takes hold of it, who keeps from profaning the Sabbath and keeps his hand from doing any evil." But verse 3 says, "Don't let the son of a foreigner who has joined himself to Adonai say, Adonai will surely exclude me from his people." The commandment here to Israel is, do not let a foreigner, the son of a foreigner, say, Adonai will surely exclude me from his people. And that's exactly what we're talking about, is that there are those who are saying Adonai wants to exclude those from his people. And it's important, as we talk about this, to remember that the middle wall of partition was broken down not so that Jews could escape,
right,
but so that the non-Jews would have access to enter in. And this is such an important thing. It says, do not let the Son of Man say, Adonai will surely exclude me from his people. And this is exactly what these Messianic Jews are saying to them, is say, to a non-Jewish people, they're saying, okay, Rabbi Jonathan, or they wouldn't call him Rabbi Jonathan, they'd just say Jonathan. Okay, Jonathan, God has excluded you. Adonai has excluded you. You are not fully part of what God is doing because you are a son of a foreigner.
Right.
When it's totally contrary to what God's saying, totally contrary to what he says in Isaiah, talking about foreigners celebrating the Shabbat, keeping these days, being holy, living righteous. And it's so important for us to understand that that doesn't do away with distinctions. It doesn't do away with genealogies. It doesn't change Gentiles to Jews or Jews to Gentiles. He's talking here and he says, don't let the son of a foreigner. It's identifiable as a Gentile, as a foreigner. But it says, don't let him say, Adonai will surely exclude me from his people. And it's a prohibition. Don't let this happen to you.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, and the argument would be, well, we're not excluding them by letting them show up.
Right.
Which some don't even allow that, as we've talked about numerous times. On one certain congregation that doesn't let Gentiles in, they give them flyers or something like a list of churches, recommended churches or something. So, but those things aren't addressed. But the thing is that including them is, if you say, well, we do include them by letting them show up, and if they want to volunteer, but they do not need to do this, that you are excluding them.
Exactly. You're excluding them from worshiping in unity with the full congregation, from participating as a part of the fullness of the community. And it says, don't let them say, Adonai will surely exclude me from his people. And it is exactly what is being done when we say, it's okay for you to come. It's okay for you to be in the pew. It's okay for you to clean the building. It's okay for you to serve in the oneg. It's okay for you to give in the offering. It's okay for you to pay tithe. It's okay for you to serve the Jewish people. But it's not okay for you to be served.
Basically, you relegate them to being Shabbos Goy.
It becomes,
which is absurd.
It becomes like Downton Abbey. If you're familiar with the show or any kind of English show about Edwardian or Victorian times, when there was an upstairs and there was a downstairs. And it was like so embedded in their culture that, the upstairs people, which was the nobility and the landlords and all them, never ate, mixed, or did anything with the downstairs people. They had their own sets of lives and only commingled when the downstairs people were serving the upstairs people.
Yeah, and I believe that this is exactly when Peter was eating with the non-Jews and Paul comes up and they separate themselves so as not to be seen with this. I think this is exactly what was happening. He was like, they were all hanging out together. They were one body of people. And then they saw the Jews and, oh, wait a minute. The Jews are here now. We're going to have to make it appear that we have distinctions and identifiers between the Jews and the non-Jews. And so pull back. And that's exactly what the Scripture was talking
Thank God Paul addressed it.
In Malachi, when this particular chapter, Malachi 1, there, God is addressing the abuses of the Levitical priesthood, and it's failing to offer proper offerings. And he's basically saying that, if you continue to do this, continue to act this way, I will not accept an offering from your hand. For from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name will be great among the nations. And in every place, incense will be offered to my name, and a pure offering. For my name will be great among the nations. So, suggesting that incense will be offered around the world to God, that the nations will offer it. Offering incense to God is a very Jewish thing to do. And that it will be that if you won't do it right, then these nations will worship me in a Jewish way and acknowledge my greatness.
And in Ezekiel, it says, in the time to come, all the nations will send representatives to Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot.
Right.
A Jewish identifier.
Right. But even this is even a greater... I'll call it an olive branch, I guess. Because it's like, this is not even them having to come to Israel.
Right.
The world, the nations will offer incense in their own places.
Right.
They will offer offerings to God in their own homes Jewishly.
Yeah. So as we get ready to wrap this part of the episode, and we may continue and just play it as another one going on, I want to read this statement. Now, this comes from a Messianic Jewish website, and it says, Messianic Jewish groups may also include those from non-Jewish backgrounds who have confirmed call to participate fully in the life and destiny of the Jewish people. We're committed to embodying this definition into our constituent congregations and our shared institutions. We're talking about here in our conversation those non-Jewish people who have confirmed a call to participate, not partially, not halfway, but to participate fully in the life and destiny of the Jewish people. And that's what we're encouraging, is that everybody in the Messianic community would allow those non-Jews that God calls into their community to participate fully in the community. And doing that, and it's possible to do that while still acknowledging that non-Jewish people are non-Jewish and Jewish people are Jewish, and that there's different callings and roles and responsibility given in the Scripture to them, but that there are universal things that are for all people that serve God. And that's when the Scripture says to all the children of Israel, or to Bnei Israel, or Paul says to the commonwealth of Israel, to the olive tree made up of Jew and non-Jew, grafted into the branches, feeding from the same root. And that olive tree looks, if you looked at that olive tree of the grafted in and the wild, it's going to look like an olive tree. You're not going to look at it and say, okay, the wild branches, those are apple tree branches. They're going to have apples. They're going to be distinct. They're part of the tree, but they're completely different in how they look and what they produce and what they do. And the olive tree, that's going to have olives. The olive tree looks like an olive tree. by all those who look at it, even though it's made up of wild branches and natural branches grafted into the same tree. I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to contact Rabbi Toby. Just feel free to reach out to any of us, comment on our social media or whatever format you're listening to. If you have a subject you'd like for us to discuss in a future episode, feel free to connect with us and let us know. We'd be happy to do so. And shalom.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.